Good morning. Welcome to those of you that are joining us. We'll get started in a few minutes. So I am Paige Cottingham-Streeter. I'm delighted to see so many friends joining. I have to say, though, this format means that I can see those of us who are panelists and fewer of you who are in the audience. So if I don't acknowledge you, my apologies, but it's nice to see familiar faces. Peggy Blumenthal, thank you so much for joining, maybe from New York, and Dr. Jolien Thomas, thank you so much for being here. You kindly introduced us to our speaker, and I see our friends in Texas, Dr. Cynthia Tante Matson, thank you for supporting CULCON over the years. And we've got a couple of current commissioner panelists and former commissioner panelists. If any of you, I recognize in Japan, it's late in the day, and in the US, some of you may still be getting your morning started, but if you're comfortable, please do join us on camera because this is a live event. Although it's a webinar and it's being recorded for future use, we definitely want to have this feel as though it's a community conversation. So feel free to join us in whatever way is comfortable. Dennis, so good to see you. Thanks for joining. I know there's a large audience, so we'll just give it another minute for our screens to populate. In the meantime, let me let everybody know that interpretation is available, both ASL for those who may find that helpful, and also Japanese. So there is an icon at the bottom of the screen that looks like a globe, and it will give you the Japanese option if you would prefer to listen to the conversation in Japanese. Thank you so much to our 4 interpreters who are making this discussion as accessible as possible. I see more are joining us, so we'll give it one more minute, and then I'd be delighted to introduce our speakers. Well, let me first introduce myself. I'm Paige Cottingham-Streeter. I serve as Secretary General of CULCON, the Conference on Cultural and Educational Interchange. I'm also the Executive Director of the Japan-US Friendship Commission, a federal grant-making agency that has oversight for CULCON activities, which is a binational advisory panel. We've been so privileged to be able to offer this series of webinars focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, thanks to the support of the US Department of State, Bureau of Educational and Cultural Affairs. I'm so delighted that so many of you have joined and tuned in for this conversation on disability. I'm excited that we have what I would call 2 champions, a champion in the pool and a champion as an advocate for disability inclusion. So we'll have 2 speakers, beginning with Hannah Aspden, and she will be followed by Dr. Mark Bookman. Mark, thank you for joining us from Tokyo. I know it's late in the day, but we're delighted that you're here. And Hannah, congratulations. You're a recent graduate of Queen's University, and also congratulations on not only competing in 2 Olympics, but also most recently receiving or earning 2 gold medals in your competitions there. So I'm going to remind everybody that interpretation is available, the ASL and also the Japanese language. If you click the globe at the bottom, you should be able to have access to that. Following the two presentations, we will have an opportunity for questions and answers. You would be a larger group, so I would invite people to use the raise hand function so that I can more easily manage the Q&A. But with that, let me say again, thank you both for joining us. I've been looking forward to this discussion for such a long time. It's lovely to be here. So Hannah, I'm going to turn the mic over to you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you today. I'm so honored to be part of this event. I'm Hannah Aspden. I'm a Paralympic swimmer who competed for Team USA in Tokyo last year and brought home 2 gold medals. I am so excited and so grateful for this opportunity to be here with you all today and share a little bit about my experience at the Paralympic Games last year and how it forever shaped the way I view Japan and its culture. My journey to Tokyo all started when I began swimming. I was born without my left leg and tried land sports like soccer and basketball, which I enjoyed, but then I tried swimming and immediately fell in love with the water. I started swimming for a summer league team at age 5 and then a year-round club team, and was eventually introduced into the world of Paralympic sports at age 10 when I competed in my first ever Paralympic meet. I also swam for my university, which I recently graduated from. One of the first things that drew me to swimming was how free I felt in the water. There, I was able to keep up with all of the other kids, and my disability didn't hold me back in the way it sometimes did on land. On that Paralympic pool deck in 2011 was the first time I'd ever been around so many people like me, each with their own story, challenges, and dreams. It was so empowering to be surrounded by examples of determination, heart, and confidence. Parasport has shown me that everyone has the power to make a difference. There, we were all united by one common goal that continues to be a key part of the Paralympic movement, changing perceptions of people with disabilities. One of our mottos for the Tokyo Games was "Show the World," and with the help of the people and organizations involved in hosting the Games, we did. Representation is important on all levels, and I've seen from personal experience how representation in sports empowers individuals in all areas of life. I've seen the difference that diversity, equity, and inclusion can make in our own communities and around the world. Through Paralympic swimming, I've had the amazing opportunity to travel around the globe and experience many different cultures and social systems. We are making huge strides, and I've seen growth in the movement and advancement in inclusion at different speeds. But the important part is that we keep moving forward. At a local level, I've seen the impact that hosting these events can have on the surrounding communities and the people within. Together, we are changing the way the world sees differences between people, the way that we see what people are capable of, and how we see ourselves. In many ways, I have seen change. During my time in Japan, I felt that change with every smile, every nod, every offer of assistance, every congratulation, and every other small interaction that made a huge impact. All around the world, people have been and continue to be impacted by COVID. These past few years have been a whirlwind, filled with uncertainty, obstacles, and disconnection. Many of the challenges that we've faced during COVID disrupted our normal days and schedules, didn't allow us to be around our loved ones, and stopped us from fully experiencing some of the most important moments of our lives. For me, that toll came along when it was announced that there would be no spectators allowed at the Tokyo Olympic and Paralympic Games. That meant leaving our families, friends, and supporters at home as we embarked on the journey of a lifetime. People who have been by our side for each step of the way to that point. My family would not be there in person to see me chase my dreams on the world's biggest stage. The seats were empty, but the hearts of the Japanese people were full. After a year of postponement and unknowns and difficult decisions, the Games looked very different than we all thought they would. There were complications, I'm sure, and struggles, but the one thing that held strong was the dedication of the Japanese volunteers and everyone involved in creating the best Games experience they possibly could. That void I expected to feel without my family present, was filled the moment I landed in Japan. I was immediately greeted with warm welcomes, smiles, and generosity. Employees and volunteers at the airport were quick to offer helping hands. They were kind and patient as they led us through customs, picking up our bags, and eventually saw us safely to the Paralympic Village. The unbelievable kindness began the second I stepped off the plane. And despite the length of the event, the long days and nights, the rain and the heat, that kindness only grew stronger with every day. I remember seeing people standing alongside the road on our bus route to and from the venues, holding up signs that said things like, "All Paralympians are my heroes," and other supportive and heartwarming statements. The bus drivers would wish my teammates and I good luck as we arrived at the pool venue. The security personnel made us feel safe, comfortable, and protected, and the volunteers treated us and our belongings with the utmost respect. They treated us like family. After my races, I swam to the side of the pool and climbed out, and a volunteer was always there and ready to hand me my crutches that I had left behind my block. A simple yet very appreciated gesture. The Olympic athletes will often leave articles of clothing or other items behind their blocks when they prepare to race. But at the Paralympics, it's very common to see prosthetic limbs, braces, crutches, wheelchairs, canes, and other adaptive equipment. The volunteers treated these items as if they were their own, handling them with care and respect, understanding that they are more than just pieces of equipment. They are parts of our identity. They represent the Paralympic movement, people with disabilities, and the challenges we'd overcome to be there. The Paralympic Games are the height of one's athletic career. It's what we work for, sacrifice for, and dream of for years. It's stressful, scary, thrilling, and brings about a roller coaster of emotions. Those moments immediately after a race can be overwhelming. I remember worrying about the long walk down a maze of hallways back to my team area. My family wasn't there to congratulate or console me. I assumed it would be quiet and I would be alone, lost in my thoughts, trying to process what had just happened. But I was wrong. No matter the outcome of my race, I felt an undeniable sense of comfort, connection, and warmth from the volunteers that lined those hallways. They were the first people I saw after the heartbreaking disqualification of my relay team, and the first ones I saw after winning a gold medal the next night. They cheered for me, congratulated me, comforted me, and despite the quiet stands, they helped make those moments so unforgettably special. When you watch the games on television, you see a clean-cut highlight reel, but what you don't see is what happens in those hallways, behind the scenes, in the cafeteria, on the buses, and in the village. The volunteers filled the role of our absent families and brought lively energy and an abundance of joy to every day. Even on the cold, rainy days late at night, when we returned to the village, the security personnel would always ask how our competition went and how we were doing. They wished us luck and congratulated us. In the cafeteria, volunteers gave us handcrafted origami swans and drew delightful artwork on the bottoms of paper cups. We were always met with smiles and positivity wherever we went, regardless of the circumstances. Every single person involved in the event that I interacted with showed me such kindness and consideration. Even during a typical games experience, maintaining that energy would be difficult for anyone, but this was anything but typical. Even with the complications of a year of postponement, and even after hosting the Olympic Games just a few weeks before we arrived, they were ready to do it all over again for us. They carried the excitement all the way through, promoting the event on social media, on signs, on the sides of buses, in the airport, giving us publicity, attention, and recognition at a level that is so rarely found in parasport. To say that I felt welcome, worthy, and seen would be understating things. They went above and beyond all expectations and did so with smiles on their faces. The people of Japan did this despite the controversy surrounding the decision to host the event. I'm sure that decision was not an easy one, but I think I speak for a lot of people when I say that I'm forever grateful for everyone who had faith and who fought to host the event in the midst of such difficult times. Because of those who helped create this incredible and unique games experience, myself and so many others have had the opportunity to experience Japan's extraordinary culture. And that is something I'll keep with me forever, and I'm not the only one. On a global scale, the Olympic and Paralympic Games represent diversity, unity, and finding common ground through sports and competition. There were over 100 countries represented at the Games, and all of us had the chance to witness firsthand the hospitality, authenticity, and grace of Japan. And as we all went our separate ways, we came home with a whole new appreciation for the truly wonderful people of Japan. The experience has given to us at the Tokyo Games will have a lasting impact that extends far beyond our few weeks together. I believe the way that Japan hosted these games will set the standard to strive for as we move forward and continue to grow and persevere together. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you so much for representing the United States in the 2020 Paralympic Games. You're also a wonderful representative of Queen's University. I'm sure your teammates and professors are quite proud. And thank you for giving those of us who had hoped to be at the Olympic Games a sense of the energy, as well as just sort of the idea of how, in spite of the challenges that were faced, Japan was able to, in fact, provide on the global stage a sense of the Olympic theme. So indeed, we appreciate your presentation, and I've got lots of questions. But before jumping into those, let me ask Professor Mark Bookman to share. You know, the theme of this presentation is accessibility and inclusion in Japan and beyond, lessons from the 2020 Paralympic Games. And I know you have been in Japan for some time. You're currently a postdoc fellow at the University of Tokyo. So we appreciate you're not only being up late at night, but helping us to understand the journey that Japan has taken to attempt to live into and be the diverse and inclusive community that the Olympic Games and the Paralympic Games wanted to highlight. So Mark, the mic is yours.
Thank you so much, Paige. Just give me one moment to share my screen. Okay, hopefully we're coming across all right. Thank you, everyone. So, hello, my name is Mark Bookman, and I am a historian of disability policy and related social movements in Japanese and global contexts, currently based at the University of Tokyo. I also work as an accessibility consultant for various government agencies and corporate entities in Japan and the United States, as well as groups like the International Paralympic Committee and the United Nations. Some of the projects that I'm involved in concern topics like inclusive education, equitable transit, and disaster risk management for diverse populations of disabled people. My interest in Japan and accessibility specifically grew out of my experiences of living with a disability in the United States. So as an immunocompromised and mobility impaired child in the US, I was often unable to play outside with my friends and instead began to read books and watch television. As I was doing that, this media really helped me to make sense of my exclusion from the world around me. And I was particularly drawn towards Japanese animation, anime, because of its explorations of the human body. Fascinated, I decided to travel to Japan for the first time in 2008 to learn more about the culture that I had fallen in love with through its popular media. And I've now lived off and on in Tokyo for the last 14 years or so. My life has been interesting, but it's not always been easy. And I've run into barriers all along the way. Let me explain what I mean. So every day I have to get up out of bed with help from a caregiver. I then transfer to a motorized wheelchair which an engineer built, and I drive it across my architect-designed barrier-free apartment. I go outside and follow yellow tactile pavement on the ground installed by a city planner until I reach a train station. I then use my government and doctor-issued disability pass to purchase a train ticket. After I reach the platform, I have to ask an attendant to prepare a ramp for me and help me get on board. I arrive at my university only to have to rely on academic administrators to prepare my classroom and make sure that I can do my job. In many ways, my life as a disabled person in Japan is kind of like a puzzle with stakeholders from different parts of society coming together to try and remove barriers to my full participation. However, these stakeholders are sometimes absent, or their activities are not necessarily coordinated in a way that supports me as an individual. So I find myself unable to access a lot of spaces and services. You can think about it kind of like this bridge, which says in Japanese, wheelchair accessible route. The architect who built this bridge clearly wanted to help, but they didn't talk about my needs as, a 31-year-old male disabled individual from the United States. They didn't ask about my wheelchair, which is too large to fit into many inclusive spaces or so-called inclusive spaces. If I took my wheelchair over this bridge, I would fall in the water. And I'm not alone in grappling with this problem. Many disabled persons in Japan face similar barriers, as do old people, parents with small children, pregnant people, and other demographics. Indeed, inclusion issues are not unique to Japan. They play out in countries across the globe. But with that said, Japan has a unique role in shaping international discussions about disability and accessibility. Interested parties often export the island nation's assistive technologies overseas, and its access making has served, and as we'll see at the end of this talk, will probably continue to serve as successful models to emulate and cautionary tales of what to avoid for other countries in the future. So today I'm going to speak with you a little bit about some of those lessons, the things that we can learn from Japan's recent access making activities. And to do that, I'm going to use the Tokyo 2020 Games as a kind of framing device. But before I unpack the legacies of the Games, locally and globally, I'd like to walk us through a recent history of disability policy in Japan to really help emphasize the transformations that the Games have helped enable. So to start, I want to take us back to the year 2000, when after decades of activism, advocates for accessibility, including disabled people, old people, parents with children, other groups, convinced the Japanese government to pass the barrier-free transportation law. This law made access to public transit a legal requirement for the first time in Japan's history. Developers began to install ramps, elevators, and other kinds of barrier-free features in transit hubs across the nation. And as disabled people gained increased access to their communities, those features were built into other public spaces, like supermarkets and department stores. In 2006, the Japanese government passed the new barrier-free law, which regulated the installation of barrier-free features in hospitals, parks, community centers, and other common facilities. But the installation of these ramps and elevators didn't necessarily guarantee accessibility to disabled people. When designing barrier-free features for public spaces, Japanese developers often put them in hard-to-reach areas to preserve regular flows of traffic and cut costs. Placement issues were compounded by the fact that relevant staff were not always trained to use these new features. A locked elevator or a misplaced ramp was usually equivalent to the absence of those type of accommodations. Furthermore, these newly installed barrier-free features were shared by multiple groups by design. Not only disabled persons, but also pregnant women, parents with strollers, old people, other groups. And accordingly, there was competition for a limited supply of accessibility features. When you add these factors together, we see how travel delays and logistical difficulties for disabled people became common. During the 2000s, it was really not all that uncommon at all for disabled individuals to wait more than 30 minutes for station attendants, store clerks to prepare ramps and paths for them. These delays were inconvenient, and trust me, they were inconvenient, but they actually became quite deadly during disasters and crises like the 3/11 triple disaster. So as some of us may know, the earthquake, tsunami, and nuclear meltdown that occurred in Japan on March 11th, 2011 were in many ways a wake-up call for public awareness around the nation's access issues. Media outlets reported how some disabled people could not evacuate their homes, and those who could were often unable to reach their non-disabled counterparts for access to key supplies, food, water, medicine. Emergency shelters and makeshift housing were rarely equipped with barrier-free toilets, handrails, and other necessary accommodations. So many disabled residents slowly deteriorated. And in the end, disabled people accounted for roughly 25% of all deaths linked to the disaster. Huge number, not talked about enough in my opinion. But it was enough to generate harsh criticism domestically and internationally, which drove government officials to adopt new policies to improve accessibility. Thanks in part to 3/11, the Japanese government promulgated the law for the elimination of discrimination against persons with disabilities in 2013 and ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities in 2014. These legal developments helped create a framework for the rapid installation of barrier-free features across society. But the creation of that legal framework, even one that was focused on anti-discrimination and usability, was in and of itself not enough to catalyze social change. Japanese officials still needed a practical vehicle to engage stakeholders in the public and private sector in implementing their new policies. And this is where it was very fortunate that Tokyo won the bid for the 2020 Olympic and Paralympic Games in 2013. The Games would help facilitate numerous accessibility reforms, which I'll divide into two categories for convenience: hard changes to the built environment, and soft educational projects. So among the hard changes tied to the Tokyo Games was the renovation of public transit facilities, hotels, and tourist sites to include barrier-free features, as well as the construction of venues that showcased best practices for access and inclusion, like the new National Stadium. Indeed, the stadium actually boasted more than 500 wheelchair accessible seats, modified bathrooms, and it signaled to many that similar projects could be undertaken elsewhere. And to ensure that these hard renovations could be used effectively, stakeholders often engaged in soft education projects to reveal barriers that were otherwise overlooked by members of the public. So, for example, some organizations of activists and volunteers set up seminars to explain why disabled individuals needed to be prioritized when it came to the use of ramps and elevators. Not just building the hard accommodation, but teaching about their importance. Collectively, these hard and soft reforms tied to the games help facilitate a fundamental shift in consciousness among interested parties in the public and private sector. Business magnates began to describe disabled persons as an untapped labor force worthy of investment. And in 2019, 2 severely disabled people were elected to the national diet. While media outlets and members of the public celebrated these developments as success stories, and they were right to do so, it's worth mentioning that they were also significantly constrained by a scarcity of human and material resources, as well as awareness issues that were eventually exacerbated by the ongoing pandemic. So reconstruction projects ahead of the Games were hampered by a lack of material supplies. For example, a Ministry of Land, Infrastructure, Transport, and Tourism survey from 2017 found that only 0.4% of hotel rooms in the greater Tokyo area are wheelchair accessible. No matter how hard stakeholders worked to improve the situation, they couldn't marshal enough resources to renovate even 1% of hotel rooms before the Games. There's a famous incident that I recall from 2019 in which the British Paralympic team was asked to pay to renovate a hotel room in Yokohama for their athletes, and then asked to pay to renovate the room back to its original shape after the Games. There was a huge financial and material limit there. A second factor that limited projects ahead of the Games was a lack of human resources. So Japan has the world's fastest aging population. Around 30% is over the age of 65. Its declining birth rate and shrinking labor force have resulted in a serious labor shortage, which means that designated staff are not always available to assist disabled people in stores, at transportation hubs, or other places of interest. Even now, roughly half of the country's train stations operate entirely without support personnel. A third factor that limited access before the Games was awareness issues. Many members of the public either didn't know about recently passed accessibility laws or didn't fully understand their implications. Newspapers were flooded with articles from local business owners asking about their role in facilitating the accessibility for disabled people. And I remember a train station attendant asking, very frustrated, how far did you have to push a wheelchair user to comply with new policies? From the train to the platform? From the platform to the ticket counter? from the ticket counter to the parking lot, all the way home, it wasn't clear. And of course, all of these issues were magnified by the COVID-19 pandemic. Construction stopped, educational projects were abandoned, and awareness issues were even more exacerbated amid confusion about unclear social distancing guidelines and what we should do during the pandemic. But even with that said, all was not lost, because every failed effort, every miss afforded activists additional opportunities when the games finally did take place. Activists used the spectacle of the Tokyo 2020 Games to call attention to problems that still needed to be resolved, encourage accountability, and enable exchanges with international advocates. Collectively, they discussed strategies that Japan could use to resolve remaining inclusion issues, as well as ways that the nation's efforts could contribute to accessibility elsewhere. The fruits of those conversations around accessibility are still ripening, but it's worth mentioning that the successes and failures over the past 2 decades, including those tied to the troubled implementation of barrier-free policies during the 2000s, the March 2011 triple disaster, and the preparations for the games themselves, each provide lessons for disability activists, policymakers, and other interested parties in both local and global contexts. Going forward, we have to think a little bit more about those lessons in greater detail and how they affect different communities whose identities may be shaped not only in terms of disability, but also age, race, class, gender, impairment type, and intersections thereof. But suffice it to say that the Tokyo 2020 Games have given us a chance to start these conversations and to think about how Japan might serve as a gateway for global accessibility. So I hope you'll join me in thinking a little bit about what the implications of the games might be for diverse groups inside and outside of Japan. And with that, I'd like to move towards the end of my talk. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Mark. That was just full of wonderful information and some guidance and instruction about not only the consequences of COVID in ways that some of us may not have experienced, but also the opportunities. So we should start the conversation that you're inviting us all to have. And as I was listening to your remarks, I was also reflecting on Hannah's previous presentation. And one of the things that I took away from Hannah was the fact that in spite of the fact that the stands were empty and her family was not with her, she felt supported, she felt respected, and that the volunteers were certainly not necessarily substitutes, but certainly supportive advocates. And so I'm wondering whether or not that public awareness that you were speaking about, Mark, sort of translated to Hannah's experience. So Hannah, I'd like to know first from you a little bit more about who these volunteers were. Did you have the chance to get to know people, or were they parents of other Paralympians? Were they part of the Japanese contingent? Were they local community members? They themselves disabled? If you could give us a little bit of context, it would be helpful just to know the journey that these people traveled in terms of not the physical journey to be there, but in terms of their knowledge and understanding of what it meant to be a disabled person and competing in the Paralympics and their needs.
Yeah, of course. I think a lot of them came from surrounding communities. I wish I knew where most of them came from and what what motivated them to volunteer and to give us their time and their support, because it's greatly appreciated. And it's that kind of stuff that they didn't have to do that. They didn't have to volunteer, but they chose to, and they did, and they didn't just meet the requirements. They went above and beyond in everything and gave it all of their energy and all of their heart. And that is something that I will forever appreciate. We had the chance to interact with a lot of them. I wish I was able to get to know more of them more personally. But we had a couple of conversations. We had pins. We would trade pins with some of the volunteers, and just small but much appreciated interactions all day, every day, no matter where we were. There was always a smile and a greeting and a "How are you? How did it go?" Congratulations, good luck tomorrow, good night. No matter what the circumstances were, it was always just such pure joy and kindness and respect and all of the things that I mentioned. Yeah, I appreciate that they were all there, and that that wasn't something that they had to do, but they decided to, and it means a lot to us.
Thank you for that response. And Mark, and as others have questions, I see there's at least one in the chat, but feel free to also use the raise hand feature. Mark, I'm wondering whether or not the experience of the volunteers is somewhat of a measure, and whether that energy and that positive support could translate in terms of policy, whether it's continued advocacy for the resources that are required, or the funding that's necessary. I'm wondering what you think about this sort of groundswell of at least support for the athletes. Can that translate into something more?
Yeah, thank you so much for the question. So there's two things. Can it translate? Of course it can. I think that there's the opportunity to take the lessons around accessibility and inclusion that we learned from conversations during, before and during the games, that the volunteers were able to witness firsthand. They can take the experiences and interactions that they've had, take that knowledge outside of the volunteer space back home with them, teach it to their children, teach it to their community members. Oh, when I was at the games, I learned the importance of having a ramp to get on the train, so I'm not being delayed. I'm going to take that and use it to rebuild my community. That's a possibility that's there, and it's one that many volunteers are now attempting to leverage for good in multiple communities inside of Japan. But there's a caveat, there's a problem. And the problem is that when the games end, how do we keep the pressure going? How do we sustain the momentum? And while volunteer organizations that were active during the games are doing their best to reflect on the lessons learned and now engage policymakers in working upon them, that issue of pressure is there. But thankfully, because Japan is dealing with the aging population crisis, there is a very visible incentive, one of many, that are leading policymakers to be perhaps a little bit more receptive than they might be otherwise to these ongoing conversations. So I think that not only is there the opportunity for volunteers to use that knowledge in other spaces, but they are capitalizing on a way that will have implications going forward.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to turn to Tom Mason, whose hand is raised, and then I'll read Bob Page's question unless he would like to ask it on screen himself. But go ahead, Tom. Thanks for joining.
Thank you, Paige, and thank you, Hannah and Mark, for such wonderful presentations. My name is Tom Mason from the U.S.-Japan Bridging Foundation, and we support students to study abroad in Japan. Mark, I'm interested to hear from your perspective what U.S. organizations can do to be better supporters of people of disabilities, to both apply for study abroad programs that are in Japan, but also to have successful experiences abroad.
Thank you, Tom. You asked one of the questions that I wanted to, so I'm glad you did. Please, Mark.
Well, thank you so much for this question. I have 100 things I want to say, but let me start by saying this. I did a Fulbright to Japan in 2014. At the time, I was interested in not disability, but esoteric Buddhism. But anyway, I was really interested in studying in Japan. And what I found is that according to both Fulbright and the Japanese government, I was apparently the first wheelchair user ever to study abroad in Japan. I don't necessarily buy that, but if the number is so small that they can make that claim, what that means is that there was no guidance, right? I had to find my own housing, find my own transit, find my own resources. In a time when, as you heard a moment ago from my talk, there was rapid legal transformation and tons of awareness problems because of that. It was a chaotic time. But one thing that I would have benefited from, and one thing that I think the US could do to make sure that other people are not lost in that chaos, is to think about developing a repository of experiences of people who have studied abroad with disabilities. So we have a database and a network to guide people about where they might study, how they might study, what strategies they can use to advocate across languages inside and outside of their institution. Because at the end of the day, if you're studying abroad, your time is not all spent in the classroom. It's spent, in your housing, going out to the bar with your friends or your restaurant, whatever it might be, contacting students who have been abroad with disability, getting their experiences into a database, and building on that is the first step, I think.
So Mark, I'm going to ask you to follow up a little bit more about that, because when we spoke earlier, I think you mentioned an initiative that you're working on. And in your presentation, you talked about the location of some of the accessible tools, whether they're steps, stairs, elevators, whether they're ramps or elevators. And I know from having been on exchanges with people with disabilities, it helps to know in advance which station is going to be able to accommodate the needs of the disabled person, and to build that time into the goings and comings. So if I recall correctly, you may be working on something that will help people know more easily where they can find the accessible devices that they need. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. So there are two resources. One, I believe Dr. Paula Curtis was so kind as to link one resource in the chat here, which is a website called Accessible Japan, which I consult for. And that is essentially a tourism-oriented website that will show for various parts of Japan which spaces are accessible, for whom, and why. Not only do we provide travel information for hotels, transit, things like that, but we also have forums for disabled and non-disabled users to communicate their experiences of accessibility in their own terms, what works for them, what doesn't work for them. But there's another project, which is what I think you're hinting at, which is a digital mapping project that I've been working on for some time now. And this is based off of work I had done at the University of Pennsylvania called the Accessibility Mapping Project. And essentially, I'm working on a mobile interface, kind of like a phone app, where anyone will be able to go in and say in their own words, using video, audio, pictures, and text, this building is accessible for me, this building is not. This door, it's wide enough for this type of wheelchair, but not this type of wheelchair. This building has a gender neutral bathroom. This building has a prayer space where it doesn't. And the idea is that you'll be able to link this information to like a Google Maps style interface. So anyone on whenever they want can report and share information about accessibility for the benefit of everyone around them. And that's another project that I'm currently working on, that I've been trying to use the momentum around the games to collect information for and leverage for the future.
Thanks for making us aware of that. I think it's going to be incredibly useful, as you say, to people with disabilities, but also people with various needs. So I'm going to go to Robert Page from Queen's University, and I can read the question, which is, you're now training for Paris 2024. In terms of support for people with disabilities, athletes, spectators, what would you like to see?
Thank you. Thanks, Bob, for the question. I think Mark mentioned a lot of great things about, ramps and elevators and accessibility in terms of mobility kind of in getting places. One of the things that I remember seeing a lot of in Japan was I forget what you called them, Mark, but the yellow strips on the ground on the sidewalks that had the kind of tracks that you could get a wheel in. Or for a lot of my friends, what I saw was I have a lot of visually impaired friends, and so they walk with canes to help, look for obstacles and things. And so they would just set the cane down in the track and then keep on going till they found that they were going. And tactile pavement. Yes, perfect. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, and I saw that was a huge help. And I remember, I think back in Rio 2016, they also had that around the pool venue. But things like that and things like ramps and elevators in easy to find locations, I think all of those are amazing for everyone just to have accessibility to places. As far as, and not just for the athletes too, I'm glad you mentioned spectators and other people with disabilities too. If any of the volunteers had disabilities or any of the spectators did, it's also important for them to have access to those facilities as well. And, ease of mobility as far as accommodations and things too. It's important for everyone involved. And, it's not just for the athletes, it's inclusion all around. And so I think we also had a lot of, buses with seats and then buses also with open spaces and the locking mechanisms for, to fill an entire bus of wheelchairs and different types of mobility devices like that too. And that's something that I hadn't seen so much of before. On typical buses, there might be a couple of spaces for chairs, but then you would see long lines of athletes in chairs waiting just for a special bus to come by for them to be able to get back and forth between venues. But in Tokyo, they had fully dedicated buses for chairs, and so that was amazing and something I'd love to see moving forward, just continuing to adapt and grow and realize that, some of the things that Mark was saying statistics wise really shocked me, and just understanding that it is a pretty big portion of the population and everyone, and it's not just people confined to chairs, it's not just people with disabilities, it's there's pregnant women, the elderly, there's a lot of people that could benefit from more accessible features just all around. And so I think I would love to see, I think Japan did an incredible job of accommodating for all of those different groups of people, whether you're athletes, spectators, volunteers, whoever you are. And I would love to see more of that moving forward.
Thank you so much for that response, Hannah. And as you were speaking, Shannon McGuire asked a question that I think you touched upon, which was basically, what are the opportunities in Paris to build on this, particularly the next level for sort of the hard built environments and soft built. You talked about things like buses and infrastructure. I don't know if there's anything you'd like to add, either Mark or Hannah, in terms of, do you have any suggestions for Paris and what they could focus on in preparation for the Paralympic Games?
If I can jump in real fast.
Please.
I do. So one of the roles that I had the pleasure of performing ahead of the games was I was on the committee, I was consulting the committee that worked on the guidelines for accessible hotels and taxis. And one of the experiences that I will never forget from that time was being asked, Mark, what do foreigners with disabilities want? Western style hotel rooms or Japanese style hotel rooms? And I remember looking at the committee asking me this, saying like, do I look like every foreigner with a disability you've ever seen? Like, do you think I can speak for everyone? And that moment really triggered in me the recognition that not only do we not necessarily know who to ask or how to ask multiple communities about these positions inside of our own country, let alone polling the athletes and spectators and friends and family who might be coming from abroad. We don't necessarily have an effective tool for doing that. So I think thinking about what that how we might engage additional communities ahead of the games, how we might leverage their experiences during the games to collect additional information. If we have athletes coming from Tokyo, from the United States, from other parts of the world to Paris, while they're there, keeping track of what works for them and what doesn't work for them. And then having a plan in place to act on that after the games. If you can set up this sort of before, during, and after short-term, long-term strategy, that's one thing that Japan was working on that I think was a bit disrupted by the pandemic, but was able to accomplish in the end. I think that Paris has a lot to learn from how that played out, and hopefully they'll be able to engage in a similar practice to make sure that we're improving accessibility, not just for the local community, but for the global community as well.
Thank you, Mark. I really do appreciate sort of that insight and think that we've been talking about the games, we've been looking ahead to Paris, but I'm also encouraging this community that's represented by individuals who are part of academic institutions that support students who want to do study abroad, as Tom described, or who are parts of organizations that do people-to-people exchange. We can also think about how do we do our programming and what do we build in and who do we speak to make sure that we're trying to at least serve as many of the participants and individuals we want to support as possible, recognizing that there's such a range of need and experience. We're getting close to our hour, but I really do want to just give both you, Hannah and Mark, an opportunity to give me, please, a bit of guidance or insight into how it is that we, as a community that's interested in supporting scholarship, achievement, the next generation to be able to thrive and excel. Hannah, in her presentation, said the Paralympic Games gave her the opportunity and people with disabilities to know what they're capable of and to let others know what they're capable of. And so as we think about the students that we're teaching and in our classrooms, and as we think about the individuals that may want to pursue careers that may seem challenging on the face of it for a person with a disability, what is it that you would want? What did you need to hear, or did you hear from either your family or faculty member or whatever advocate that made it possible for you to pursue your goal and your dream, to be in Japan, to be in the pool? Hannah, I'll start with you.
I think it's kind of nice having the perspective of having been a swimmer all of my life and then also getting to swim collegiately, which I, when I was younger, wasn't sure if that would be a possibility. And even just a few years ago, before I went to college, would have been very difficult for a Paralympic athlete. I think Queen's University, I think my head coach, Jeff, is here on the call today. But I remember meeting with them for the first time and just being terrified that, they're not going to let me swim here. Like, I'm not fast enough. I'm not going to score points, all of those worries of, what am I capable of? Is this something that I'm going to be allowed to do, able to do? And I was met with such a warm welcome. And you know, they were so willing to work with me and adapt and accommodate and understand that not just me, but everyone on the team is on an individual journey, you know, but working together towards a team goal, but that everyone's going to need something different. And, you know, whether it's visible or whether it's not visible, whether you have a physical disability or not, everyone has challenges that they face in their life. And it's important to recognize that you might not always be able to see it upon first glance, but everyone has something that they push through every day. Everyone has something that they're going to have to face. And so understanding that everyone's on their own path and has their own challenges is something that I really saw when I ended up at Queen's University, because I saw that he just commented.
Yes.
Yeah, they were so open to what does each individual on this team need. It wasn't just because I came in as an amputee. It was I was another athlete on their swim team, and they were gonna, you know, help me achieve whatever my goal was, even if it looked a little bit different than everybody else's. And so one thing that I think would be important for people to hear and to remember is that everyone has their own challenge and everyone is on their own path. And as long as you surround yourself with support systems that are going to understand that and support you as you chase your dreams, I think anything is possible.
Thank you for that. And we all need more Jeff Dugdales on our team. Thank you, Hannah. And Mark, I'll let you have the last word.
Oh, no pressure at all, right? So, no, there's a lot that I want to say, but I think first off, the thing that really inspired me, or rather the person who gave me a message was someone who said, look, if you ask anyone how healthy they are on a given day, what their stamina is like on a given day, if I ask you, how far can you walk today? Does that make you disabled or non-disabled? If I ask you, you know, how long can you write today? Does that make you disabled or non-disabled? The line is not clear for anyone. The way that we think about how we build policies around that line, support networks around that line, is not clear for anyone. Disabled person may not know their own limit. Non-disabled person may not know their own limit. The accommodations we build may help someone, may not help someone. But the reality is we all need support. We all, picking up on something that Hannah just said, you know, one size fits one. We all have our own needs to be able to go forward. And I think the idea that really triggered my transformation of thought was that thinking in terms of disability as special accommodation, thinking in terms of disability as the separate identity, didn't really work. Rather, thinking in terms of accessibility, something that we all have needs, we are all attempting to be accommodated, and we need to think about how all of our limits are variable and dependent on context. That was the key message that I had learned. And as soon as I heard that, you know, I realized, wait a minute, this is why the train system doesn't work for some people and does work for others. Some people can get on the train. That means they can get to school. They can get to school. That means they can get qualified for work. Then get qualified for work. That means they can, you know, get money for entertainment. They can get money for entertainment. They can live in a community. They can live in a community. They can transform that community. Just because we built the community in a way that helps some people some of the time, doesn't mean we can't reimagine it to help more people most of the time. And I think that's what we really have to start thinking about, is how these arbitrary definitions of who deserves help, who needs help, who doesn't need help, need to be restructured. We need to start thinking around how we can help our community members wherever they're at. And the first step and the last word is talk to your community members about what they need. Ask them and start a conversation. And that's how I think we have to go.
Mark, thank you so much for that wise reflection, those wise words, and the fantastic information. We could have a whole nother hour-long conversation, but I'm afraid we've run out of time. I want to thank you, Hannah Aspden, I want to thank you, Dr. Mark Bookman. You've both been really inspirational, and I look forward to following your future success. Thank you to our audience, and we look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, which will be in September. You'll be hearing from us. And of course, much thanks to our interpreters who've been working so hard to make it possible for all of us to fully participate in this dialogue. Have a wonderful rest of the day and be safe. Bye-bye.